All right, well, we'll just assume this is everybody. So hi, everybody. My name is Sebastian E.F.E.Ebarb. I am the design director for the city of Boston. We're going to talk a little bit about building and maintaining a government website, but that might have been a little bit of a rough title when I originally got asked to speak here. When I started thinking about this project, or thinking about this presentation, I should say, and how to present it, one of the things that kept coming up, and I spent a lot of time actually not only just talking with our staff, but talking with staff from a variety of different cities, municipalities, and governments within the country and around the world. We actually have a Slack channel, a municipal design Slack channel. Oh, hi everybody, welcome. We actually, okay, cool. And so we asked them kind of what they wanted to convey to the Drupal community and what they wanted you guys to hear. And the biggest thing that they wanted us to talk about was partnerships and how partnerships move into creating and designing a website. One of the things that you will hear me often say in this talk and outside of here is that govs just don't have the money necessarily to support all of the staff that we need. And that's across the board, whether it's in tech or otherwise. And so we obviously rely very heavily on a lot of outside vendors and a lot of outside supporters in order to move things forward. And so I wanted to take some time and talk a little bit about like how best to partner with us so that we can then kind of build a .gov together, because I hope that all of you are interested in working in .govs or with municipalities in order to make better products and make a more enjoyable user experience and just better tools, because we clearly want to do that across the board. So I'm first going to start out giving you a little idea of what happened with Boston.gov, how we went through the process, and then I'm going to kind of talk to you guys a little bit about tips and tricks. Fighting off a cold, sorry. Tips and tricks on how best to partner with us. How many folks are designers? How many folks are dev? Okay, good. This is mostly going to be aimed at you, so enjoy. So just a little bit about City Hall and kind of what our day-to-day is like. So obviously we potentially serve about 3 million people in the Boston metro area. Most people work in or around Boston within that number. And obviously we have a lot of different users who need a lot of different things, everything from paying a parking ticket to knowing whether or not their street's going to be plowed in a snowstorm and everywhere in between. We have about 75 different departments, programs, and initiatives. Each one of those has their own special needs. So we're talking about things like food initiatives, which is people who might live in food deserts, things like that, bringing them food and materials and figuring out better ways for them to get access to food versus sanitation or something like, I'm trying to think of something else, but a third thing yet to come. So you can see that we have a wide variety of topics that we have to cover. It's a little bit different than, let's say, an e-commerce site or even something for architecture or anywhere in between in that sense. Before I started here at the City of Boston, that's what I did. I did large-scale branding for cities and nonprofits. And so we have basically the needs of a nonprofit and a large-scale industry for if you were to take 75 different nonprofits and programs and just kind of shove them together and then say, like, figure it out. So originally when we started the project about 3 years ago of redesigning our .gov, this is actually what it looked like. If anybody was in the talk just next door about accessibility, they talk a lot about Boston.gov and what we did. So this was the site when I first got here. You'll notice that it's hard to use. Is the way that I would say it. There's a lot going on here because essentially everybody was shouting at once and no one was being heard. Everybody wanted to get all their information out, and it was just insanely difficult in order to get all those 75 different voices talking in unison. Also, this site was actually developed before the iPhone. So at the time, it was extremely cutting edge for what it was. We were the best, the brightest, the fastest, the smartest in terms of what was being done for a .gov. But obviously, when you take the span of 10 years and you don't do much in terms of upgrading it, you have some problems. So we obviously wanted to bring it into today. And we obviously wanted to make some changes, including mobile usability and things like that. but we also wanted to make sure that we picked great partners. So in doing so, you'll see our great mayor up there who had the vision to update the website. Yasha Franklin-Haj, who's been, I know, mentioned a few times during the conference, who's perhaps one of the most brilliant leaders I've ever worked under. Both had the really good foresight to hire Lauren Lockwood, who then had the great foresight to hire me and Jim, who's sitting here in the front. And this is the original team. When I first started 3 years ago, it was me and 2 other content editors. We've grown the team over time, and you'll notice that there's some folks from Acquia in there and IDEO. This is before we were able to bring in Genuine Interactive as well, which thank you all of those folks for our help. So the great thing is today we've actually grown. We have programmers, we have a digital storyteller / videographer. We have a number of product managers and project managers. And all of this is to say that we've grown, which is wonderful. But the reality is, even with a team this size, we still need to work with a lot of outside vendors, and we want to make sure that we're working with the best. So a little bit about our history with Acquia, IDEO, and you'll notice, unfortunately, I didn't put Genuine in here, but Genuine was contracted out through Acquia, which was great because we got to work with so many amazing people over there. When we originally put the bid out, we actually split the bid into 2 different pieces. From a personal standpoint, I still think that might not have been the right choice, but I think that we ended up with good partners, so I'm really happy that we ended up where we did. But IDEO was primarily to take the brand, and Acquia was primarily to take programming or development. And the 2 never actually fully met in the way that you would expect because of the way that we actually timed everything out. We had a 7-month run period from start to finish in order to get Boston.gov up and off the ground. If you do take the time, you can see how that politically lines up with certain events. But we don't need to go into all that at the moment. So essentially, we wanted to get this off the ground. So we gave IDEO only a few weeks lead time in order to begin designing. And then Acquia quickly followed up with working on their needs and building things out. So we initially chose Drupal because of its flexibility and automation. That's something that we've heard across the board for all .govs who we've talked to who now use Drupal. The reason that it's kind of become this standard is because it's got automation. One of the things that I'll harp on a little bit here as we kind of move forward is the idea that Boston is a huge city and we have a lot of resources. Most cities, municipalities don't have the resources that we have, and so how do you build and think around those sorts of problems? And automation is probably the #1 thing to think about when we start talking about building a .gov. The less work that we can take off of the one person who can update the website, the better it will be, the more information will flow, and the more our constituents will be happy, that's our end goal, right? We want our constituents to be happy and find useful information. Also, if at any point you guys have questions, comments, feel free to shout them out. We can do it at the end too, but I want everybody to feel like they can participate. So this is what we ended up with. This is Boston.gov. You can check it out. It is now mobile friendly, thank God. And we have a lot of really cool features and functionality that we continue to build out to this day. In fact, one of the biggest things that we just released is we're one of the first cities in the country to have the ability to buy an online death certificate without going through a third-party vendor. That might seem like a small thing, but when you reduce the cost of buying a single death certificate from $40 to $12, that makes a huge difference in the constituent's life, especially, I don't know if you've ever had to deal with a death in the family, but you need up to sometimes 40 death certificates. So you can imagine for some of our poor and low-income residents, they could definitely use that help. And honestly, who wants to pay $40 for a death certificate? But it also adds a level of convenience and reduces lines at City Hall. So these are all really interesting things that we're working on in order to expand the offering that Boston.gov has. So what we ended up with overall is we were built in Drupal 7. We are going to Drupal 8. We're in process of beginning migration right now. I know a couple of folks had questions about that beforehand. If you have more questions, you can talk to Jim or myself, and we're more than happy to answer any of them around that. We went from 1 to 30 active content editors. That's a huge difference, especially in something like a snowstorm where people aren't allowed to sleep because somebody's got to be updating the website constantly. but it allows more people to jump on, provide better and more accurate information, and it's not going through a single person who can mess it up. And in reality, the team that runs the website is not necessarily the people who understand the content. We're just the people who understand the website. So we want to make sure that those 30 active users are the best folks to speak to any one particular thing. We rewrote 1 million words. We launched the new brand for Boston.gov, the B with the underline, if you haven't had a chance to check it out. And we've consolidated 10 microsites. A lot of people, because you saw the old website, were just like, we're not feeling this. And so they went off and they created their own, WordPress sites or what have you. And we wanted to get people back into our little house, and we've been extremely successful about that. Yes?
How did you architect the microsites?
How did we what?
Architect the microsites, like nodes or groups or something?
Yeah, so we just brought it in as if they were a different a department, essentially.
I just mean, how did you separate it for the users within the one site?
We didn't. So we, it's the short answer. What we found, that's a really good question. So what we found was that people obviously wanted better search, and that was one of the things that we were doing a poor job of on the old site. And so by adding just better search, people were able to find it. And so we didn't need to break anything out. In fact, most of those microsites were really poorly trafficked from the beginning. And it wasn't that the content didn't need to exist, but actually people couldn't even find it. So it didn't, by bringing them into the fold, it actually gave them more visibility.
You didn't need a microsite.
Exactly. More often than not, you do not need a microsite. We sometimes frame that from the perspective of saying, like, we can build you a site on Boston.gov, and that makes people feel better because it allows them to grasp, somebody who's not technical can understand this is my thing. And you're like, okay, great, like that's your thing. But in reality, it all just kind of coalesce and coexist with each other. So what's next? We're migrating to Drupal 8. We're adding more automation. And we're going to be doing a lot more user testing. We did a lot of user testing as we moved throughout the process, but obviously as we build new things and create new tools, we want to do more and more user testing, and we want to be as agile as possible when moving forward. Actually, death certificates is a really good example. We went and met with a bunch of undertakers. Like, did not know that was going to happen when I took this job, who are super users of death certificates. Yes?
So the user testing is in person, a mix of in person and remote?
We do not do remote. I shouldn't say we don't do remote. I'm not against it. Almost all of our user testing is done in person, and almost all of our user testing is done with actual citizens. We don't.
Or do you bring them in?
Oh no, we literally just walk downstairs to the plaza. And we were like, oh, you're online to get a death certificate or pay a parking ticket? Do you mind answering some questions? We do it pretty frequently. Actually, 5 times this week, we've done user testing on our plaza. When it's not raining, we do it inside, or when it's raining, we do it inside. But we talk to real citizens, and we talk to tourists, and we talk to anybody who will come and kind of talk to us. We don't offer any benefit for it, other than to say, like, help your city. And we've had actually a tremendous amount of success just walking outside and talking to people like they're humans, which I know Gov is not supposed to do that, but we're trying to move away and become more human. One of the things...
The fact that people come in there every day.
Exactly. We have a little bit of a captive audience in that regard, and they're already mad about Gov, and so we're like, we can help you make this better, and they're like, yes, we want to make this better.
Escape that building once you're in there.
Oh, it's amazing. We're adding more wayfinding. That's actually one of the things that we're going to be doing. Future user testing. Pattern library extension. We have an awesome pattern library that we're going to be expanding in the future and hopefully fleshing out and making a lot stronger. And then we're rethinking our legacy systems such as death certificates, birth certificates, all that sort of stuff. So that's generally what we're doing in the future. So a lot of you guys or folks might be thinking, like, how do I get in on this .gov action? Like, there's money there. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about helpful hints and what we look for in terms of partnering. And again, I want to just remind you, like, these are also things that we heard from other communities who have done a lot of partnering, not only in the Drupal space, but in other spaces. And if you're not necessarily a Drupal person, that's okay, because a lot of this stuff will pertain to you as well. This also applies to non-dev folks as well. So we need partners, not vendors. This is probably the most important thing, and I think I repeat it like 3 times. And a lot of people pay a lot of lip service to this sort of thing. But the reality is, we know what we know, and we don't necessarily know what we don't know. And it's really important when we partner with somebody that they take their expertise and bring it to us. And in that sense, be a vendor. We don't want you just to do the job, but rather to see some of the holes that we don't, especially when we're talking about a very small community. Like if you think about Hyannis, that's down on the Cape, like they don't have necessarily 5 developers to sit around and think about like, oh, what's the best way to do this? So we're relying on you guys, regardless of what field you're in, if you've been hired or you're looking to come in, to share your expertise, but then also to take the same kind of, we would hope, the same kind of stake that we do in the product that we're building. Obviously, you're going to work on .govs that maybe don't have to do in Massachusetts if you live in Massachusetts or Boston, but we would hope that you would take the same kind of passion for working on a project that would be in your home city and take it further and think about it further out, or take that same passion and put it in the same place, and understand, as some of the other speakers have talked today and over the last couple of days, about like listening to what the user needs and being amenable to that, even if you are a developer. Just because you think you know what you know doesn't mean that you can't be corrected or that you can't come to the table with new information that the .gov or the government agency might not have. The first people that we talk to when we meet you guys, assuming that you're not an individual contractor, is sales. It is infuriating to deal with sales. I'm sure all of you have to deal with sales as well. But the reality is we get promised the world, and then it's very frustrating when the reality shows up because someone says, yes, we can do that. Yes, we can do that. But no one will ever say your budget doesn't determine that, or your budget doesn't allow you to do that. It was extremely frustrating in our process, regardless of who we worked with, to feel like we were promised a lot and then not everything was able to show up. I think overall a great job was done, but at the end of the day, things like we were asked for a lot more automation, things like that, and like we got a lot of what we asked for, but we didn't fully get everything we asked for because one thing was promised and then we realized that we didn't have the budget for the rest. And so I think that we can be a little more upfront with each other about the realities of those situations, especially with a government agency, because we're spending somebody else's money, and at the end of the day, someone's going to ask us why we didn't do the thing that didn't get made, especially if it's top of our priority list. So pushing on your sales department to be as honest as possible is extremely useful to us, and it wastes a lot less time on both ends of things.
Question?
Yes?
Are you an agile shop?
We are an agile shop, but I'm going to get to that in just a moment. I have a whole little section on that. And I understand we will talk about the financial issues there as well. So ADA or bust. As a government agency, we have to follow ADA. It's not a choice, it's not a question. So when we hear vendors, and I don't think anybody from the Drupal world has ever been like, do you really want to do ADA accessibility? But we have had vendors do that. First of all, it's just best practices across the board. Everybody should be doing it. It's not a question that anybody should really be asking, do you want to? It should just be incorporated in your work. But we try very, very hard, as in user testing, as in walking out and working with, we have a whole commission on disability to make sure that folks are being included in every aspect, from making sure that we have diverse photos, to making sure that things can be on a teletype. That should be automatically part of your work. And when we have to push vendors to kind of say, hey, like, you need to actually make this accessible, it's very frustrating because you should know that from the get-go. It's a legal requirement on our end. So one of the important things to remember is having an exit strategy even before you start. And this is actually really important to hear when you're pitching to us, that you have an exit strategy. Less so, I would say, with a large organization like Boston. But again, when you're talking about a small place like, let's say, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, right? They're not necessarily going to, they may or may not, but probably won't have 10 developers on staff. So the reality is eventually you're going to have to hand this off, and you might actually have to hand it off to somebody who's not technically inclined. So what is that strategy? How are you thinking through that handoff before you even pitch? And I think that, or I know that, if you can talk about that early in a way that's cohesive and in a way that is easy to understand, it makes it a lot easier for folks to trust you in the journey, because in the reality, at the end of the day, what we've been hired to do as people who work in government is to hire people who we trust so that we can build things that other people can trust. So it's like this weird dynamic, but if you can prove that we can put trust in you by understanding what the individual needs of every particular program or every particular government that you're working with, like if you can prove to us that you understand those, you're more likely to shoot up to the top of the list, in my mind. Those are things that I look for, rather than someone just being like, I did the job, bye. Like that doesn't accomplish much for us, and it certainly doesn't accomplish enough for our end users. Which gets to the point, again, that our citizens are our end users, not the folks who are actually in front of you who are hiring you. That's often, we lose sight of that sometimes because it's easy to say as a citizen, I believe this, I believe that, which is why we're constantly user testing for things. But if you can pitch how you're going to make a citizen's life better, again, you're going to move to the top of the list a lot quicker than somebody who's just like, we're going to build this thing for you. Okay, great, but how is that going to translate out to the end user? Again, a lot of this stuff has general principles that you can carry out through all of your projects, but we focus on these things as a government because it's so important, because at the end of the day, like, we answer to millions of people, and it's not just with dollars, because no one's buying anything from us, but we get a lot of angry emails. We get a lot of angry emails when we do things wrong. And we, we go to community forums and people tell us when we do things wrong. My neighbors know what I do. I user test with my neighbors a lot because they just walk up to me while I'm gardening and they're just like, hey, this part of the website's screwed up. When are you going to fix that? And so we hear that on a daily basis. It's inescapable. But that's why we want to make such a great product, is because we live here, we love where we are, and then also we're gonna hear it. So this is the next thing. Regardless this.
I just had a quick question
before
you move on. So you have 30 content people that do content on the site?
Yep.
And so when you bring in one of those other sites that were microsites, bringing them in, are you basically, if they want to make changes, do they submit those changes to your team?
Yep. So essentially we have 30 content authors, and then we have a handful of people who can actually approve content. There are only a few people who can. Some departments produce so much content so quickly, and often sometimes with legal ramifications, that they're just like, go do your thing.
Yes.
We're not going to stand in your way. But yeah, we have a team of people who approves, or a small team of people who approves and sends it out.
But in some cases, those smaller departments do get to add their own content.
Oh, everybody gets to add their own. Anybody who wants to learn how to add content can learn to add content. The only thing that's being limited right now is how many people are willing to learn and how much they're willing to take on. You also have to recognize, as a government, we have PIOs, we have folks who do content, but not every department necessarily has, people leave, it's hard to replace people. So even if you're trained, it might not necessarily be your job, and it's hard when you have 30 other things that are not your job that you have to do on top of the stuff that is your job.
Right.
And then they're also update the website.
Right.
But whoever wants it, we pretty much give it to them. We don't necessarily give them publishing rights, but we will give them the ability to add the content, change content, and then it'll be approved to go out.
Okay.
Yeah. So one of the things that when we first started, and I'll talk a little bit about this in a second, when we first started Boston.gov, a lot of the folks on the team had never heard of Drupal before, or had a vague understanding of what Drupal was, even after the pitch and things like that. And so when you're, even as a designer, developer, whatever you may be in this room, talk to people on their level and educate them as you go. It's a lot easier to take a couple minutes, don't use jargon, and explain things, move it forward, and then you can progress as you move forward. And that way everybody's feeling comfortable about what's actually being said, rather than things just being thrown at people. Again, it goes to a level of trust and understanding and feeling like you're a partner. rather than somebody who's just like telling you what's going to happen. This is what you end up with. I hope you like it. And I think that difference is key in terms of making a partnership and, again, moving you to the top of that big list. So these are all things that I wish I had known, or other folks had commented that they wish they had known when they started the process in how to build and, again, maintain a .gov. So most folks who I talk to, whether they be from .gov or not, this is pretty much what they conveyed to me, how they felt. So about a third of the way through the project, they understood kind of what Drupal was about. And the reason that at that point they understood it, it jumped up, is because someone actually explained how Drupal worked. So obviously there's lots of different details to every different language that you program in, and all of them have their little foibles and little ways that you'd have to deal with it or think around a problem. Most designers who have not touched Drupal before, it's a very simple kind of process, right? You design the thing, someone goes build the thing, you're like, oh, this is like, a couple pixels off, you fix the thing. That's for a relatively small site, right? A medium site, you're gonna obviously think more about site architecture, you're gonna have a lot more thought process in it, but you won't necessarily have thought about something like a module, because even in a mid-level site, even in a small e-commerce site, you're not necessarily building out in like the specific way that Drupal thinks. And again, bringing people along for that education at the beginning of the timeline will waste that much less time. I'm not saying talk to people like they're idiots, but maybe talk to people like they've never worked in Drupal before, because a lot of people haven't. Obviously, you guys are experts, and that's amazing, but bring it down to the level where folks aren't experts, because most people who are in Gov aren't experts in the thing. That's why we hired you in the first place, right? Or hopefully have hired you in the first place. Because we don't know what we're doing, so we're relying on you to educate us, along with building whatever we've asked you to build. Okay, so waterfall versus agile. The short answer is that it is somewhere in between the two. It is much better, as somebody who came from a world where we had to watch hours, and I came from, I'm trying to think of the best way to phrase this. So as somebody who came from private sector, we had to watch hours, we had to worry about like how long a project was going, all that sort of stuff. So waterfall, for the most part, that's where we went. It's just easy. You design the thing, somebody builds the thing, it moves forward. We don't question it a lot. The reality is that we can't do that. We don't want to do that in Gov. But we also recognize that everybody's got constraints on them, and we're not unrealistic to it. So what we have found when working with a vendor, working with a partner, is that somewhere in between is actually pretty good. So doing an initial design and then maybe even taking a break where you have maybe a month or 2 months for everybody else on the other side of things, the non-programming side of things, to take a moment, recalibrate what we have, do a little bit of a test, or even run an initial pilot, which is what we did for Boston.gov, allows us to then reformat and reframe. So being able to build in large periods where we can rethink things, knowing that we will have more sprints, more sections later, where we can pivot, means that you're not stuck as a developer or as a company, like just working on this thing that you're just going to change, but rather taking that breath. Yes?
Yeah, that's not anything. You're spiking. That's fine. That's cool.
But for us, you have to realize that I hear what you're saying, and I don't disagree with you. Internally, we are agile, is probably a better way to frame it, versus when we work with a partner or an outside vendor. Yes, you're right, we do spike. We aspire to be more agile where we can, if that makes sense. Yeah. And so we're always looking for ways in which to partner and find more agile directions. I have found, and this is a personal, very few folks actually who want to be agile. I have found many folks have said they want to be agile, and then we don't necessarily get there.
Agile by name, not by action.
Correct. With that said, we love partnering with people. So like, if we can I think that's just something that, as the industry thinks about being agile versus waterfall versus spiking versus whatever it may be, like finding better ways to incorporate things into hard, large projects. It's always going to be a question, right? But I don't think anybody's fully solved it. I know that there are agile agencies out there, and I've seen amazing work come out of them. But it's rare to find folks who actually are.
Can I ask one more quick one?
Yes, please.
Are you Jira?
No.
Are you, what system do you use for managing your agile projects?
Jim, do you want to?
Mainly GitHub. So we have project style, Canon, Kanban, whatever how you pronounce it, boards in GitHub. It's built right in. We used to use ZenHub as an add-on to it, but we actually moved to the standard GitHub project approach.
So that's your agile and your collaboration as well.
Yeah, our idea is we wanted to make things as public as possible, and we want everything from like our kind of development design process to the code to everything we do is all in public repositories on our GitHub page.
Yeah.
Stay with you though, even after.
Oh.
We don't
I saw your hand first, and I'm going to get to you second.
How important is innovation in your project?
Well, I mean, that's really broad. What do you mean by innovation?
Well, just innovating, coming up with new ways to solve things, because you can't do that in waterfall, right? You can't innovate in waterfall.
Right, and so like that, I mean, it's important to us in the sense that everything comes from user feedback at the end of the day.
Right, so you're testing,
Right.
you're getting reality. And
Yeah, so we obviously we come up with our own hypotheses, and sometimes we come up with something really brilliant, and we're like, that's very different than anything that anybody else has done. We get a lot of our thought, or our interesting thoughts, our best thoughts actually come from the public.
Yeah.
And so we design to that. So in that sense, we're trying to be innovative.
Yeah.
We will often take what people say and then extrapolate it to the extreme and see how far we can go with it.
And that makes you agile.
Exactly. You had another
I have too many questions because I'm actually working on the Mascot project right now.
Oh,
so
yeah.
I just will save them.
Okay.
Until I-
Just come on down later and we can talk.
Yeah, we should partner more.
Yeah.
So priority shift, and just be ready for that. This goes, again, back to some of the other things that we're talking about. Finding ways to work with your government partners and vice versa to recognize the fact that sometimes it takes a little while for the chief of staff to see everything, and then all of a sudden, sometimes, like it's normally not a huge shift, but like maybe we change color, maybe we change the way that something's laid out because we get more input, not just from political folks, but also from a department that might not have had a voice in the initial rounds of information that we had. Again, with 75 departments, programs, and initiatives, like there's a lot of different voices that need to be heard, and sometimes we like to make changes on the fly. All right. So one of the things that I wish that we had started with, and I hear over and over again, we're going to run out of time, and I apologize for that. One of the things I hear over the time is that I really wish we had a pattern library from the day we launched. Again, if you're a small institution, one of the easiest things to do is say, we don't know how to program the thing, we don't know how to build the thing. They might not have even a small town, might not even have a designer, they might not have a programmer, but they can point to something. They can point to a brand guideline, or they can point to a pattern library so that they can easily share that information quickly and across the board with a variety of different vendors, and they don't need to sit there and pretend like they understand tech. Again, being a good partner means leaving somebody, having that exit strategy, and leaving people with good information that they can then carry out. I don't need to go into this too much more, but essentially it's the same thing I've been harping on this entire time. Small cities, small towns, small municipalities need the same level of help that Boston does, and in fact I would say you would probably need to leave them with more tools, not less tools. One of the things that we use to evaluate whether or not something has been successful, and again this can go to pitching or this can go to just moving through a process of developing a website, is did you as a partner push us, or did you just do the job? And that's one of the things that allows us to decide whether or not, if you were a good partner or just a vendor, but then it also allows us to decide whether or not we want to continue working with you in the future, just moving forward. The other thing that I kept hearing over and over again is that Drupal won't solve all of our problems. Obviously, sometimes you got to develop in another language. You have to develop around other bugs that might have been pre-designed into legacy systems, things like that. And so building the most flexibility into this system that you've created for the next person to come along and build is obviously probably one of the most paramount things that we can ask for from our side of things. So, any more questions before? Okay. So, launch is just the beginning. I just want to talk to you guys a little bit about what we as a government are thinking about as we move past launch. You might be done with the project, but these are the things that are on our minds. So again, we might be hiring you, or we might have to hire another vendor, or we might be doing things internally. But these are all things that we're looking out for as we kind of move forward. So these are some things that we've already talked about in terms of what Boston.gov is kind of building and thinking about, but legacy systems is probably the #1 big thing that we have to deal with. Often anybody who's had a website before, especially in government, has hacked together some sort of payment system, has hacked together some sort of way for people to know when their car's been towed, and often will borrow from other folks to create some weird hodgepodge of whatever kind of works, Google Forms, weirdness. But the reality is all of those things with a new website is going to cost us, we have to, as soon as we address and create a new website, we have to address all those other things that wouldn't be addressed in a normal building out of a basic website for a gov. So that's things like what happens when your car gets towed and figuring out how people are going to find that information on this new website. The public, once they see this new thing, this new shiny, beautiful thing, is going to start finding all those little holes that you didn't get a chance to pay for or fix, and then they're going to start saying, well, why isn't this fixed? And it's going to happen from day one. I can tell you that because we got feedback day one when people started finding like they had to pay their parking ticket on the old site, not the new site, which they still pretty much have to do. And so people start asking questions, well, what did all that money go to? And what did all that time go to? And which is, when in reality, you know what all that went to. We know what all that went to. It went to this great new website that's actually going to do all this stuff for you, but you haven't taken the time to figure that out yet. All you know is you need to pay your parking ticket, and it's still in a legacy system. Forms is another really big one. A lot of companies, or a lot of .govs will contract out for forms, but how is that integration going to actually work for us? And is there a way to do that seamlessly so that it feels like it's still on the same website? That's not necessarily a problem for you unless you're somebody who builds forms or can build something for us that can do that. But the reality is we're going to have to figure out how that works because we have a lot of forms in .gov. Online payment systems and making sure that payments are secure. Boston.gov, we don't keep any of that information. We don't want to keep any of that information. We don't have anybody's credit card, none of that stuff. We use third-party vendors to secure all that stuff, but how is that, again, going to integrate? And as you move through the process of creating the website, we really need you to take those things into account, even if it's not something that you solve. And then, of course, there are always things that we never saw coming. There's lots of stuff that we never saw coming. Even with a small, like, again, Portsmouth, Maine, they have some of the same problems that we do, things like parking tickets, things like snow removal, but at the same time, like, they might not necessarily have the time, the energy to go through every single thing that they might possibly have on that website. So things will pop up, things will change, and all of that has to, what we're end up with is we're holding this website, whether you're affiliated with it or not, and we have to then figure out how to then move all this stuff that we maybe didn't even think of into it. So how do we build a more flexible environment for that? So I'm going to take the last couple of minutes here to just talk about just to remind everybody about some of the important things that I talked about. Make sure you have an exit strategy from day one. Again, one of the most important things that you can do, making sure that we're not left holding a bag of, it works for now, but will it work for the future? I cannot begin to tell you how hard it is to get funding for the things that we create in government. It will often take city council to pass legislation. It will take all sorts of level of bureaucracy and stuff like that. So we very much are always focused on trying to do it right the first time. I think that we've been very lucky in Boston in that we realize that we are not going to do it right the first time, and that's okay. that we have lots of place for iteration, and that it's something that will constantly be moving and changing throughout time, and that it will never be done. That's one of the reasons that I joined this team, is because that was what I was pitched, that the website will never be done. It's not only good job security, but it makes for a better product, and hopefully we will always be listening to what our clients, aka citizens, need to hear. But at the end of the day, somebody will step off from a project, a vendor, a partner will step off from a project, and we're going to be the ones holding the bag, and we need to make sure that that bag is actually something that's fully useful for everything that we can think of, or as much as possible in the future. Obviously, nobody's a mind reader, and no one can no one can divine what's going to happen. But the more flexible we can make the system, the better off we will all be. All of this leads to being a good partner, not necessarily a vendor. The more that we can feel, again, that you are in this with us, the better we will all be. I threw a lot of different things at you, but one of the things that we're always looking to talk to people about is what we're doing next and what you guys can do to help. So you can always lend a hand. We are 100% open source in everything that we do. If you ever feel like you want to, help us out, feel free to email us at digital@boston.gov, and we can maybe assign you some tickets. Maybe. All right. You can follow our work at boston.gov/digital. Everything that I'm talking about in one way or another has been talked about. We have some long form and short form blog posts. We talk about design, we talk about dev, we talk about all sorts of really fun, interesting, hopefully fun and interesting stuff. And then you can give us our feedback. We have a feedback button on boston.gov if you guys find a bug, an issue, things like that. Please feel free to just let us know. And we are kind of hiring. We're always kind of hiring. Again, it's always hard to find good talent, but it's also really hard to make sure that we can hire people at all. Again, we're always asking for money. We're always asking for stuff from budget and folks like that above us. So it's really important that when we do have those positions open, that we hire great people like you. And so always keep in contact with us. Let us know if you're interested. We're more than happy to sit down, have a cup of coffee, have a little chat, and maybe see if there are some openings that might be happening in the future, if they're not already there. So thank you. All right. So I talked really fast, and I know there were lots of questions, and it seemed like you might have had a lot of questions. But yes.
Perhaps leading into some of the other comments, how do you, if at all, coordinate or share information, ideas, whatever, with Mass.gov?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we actually started our process before Mass.gov, and Lauren Lockwood, who is no longer chief digital officer, she stepped out and she moved to Philly. And we now have Jeanette Falvey, whose name I'm probably mispronouncing, but has stepped in, and we work very closely with that team. I know that, especially in the initial building process, I can't even tell you how many times we took trips over there to talk with them and work with them. I don't think we're there every day, but whenever, I like to believe that whenever they need us, we're there for them, and vice versa. We have a very good working relationship.
Is there any shared budget between the organizations?
Absolutely not.
Totally not. Yeah.
No. So I wish I had their funding.
Yeah.
That would be really sweet. Our original theory, which it's a dream that I still hope that will happen, is because we're open source, and it has actually happened to some extent, and because we are a bigger entity, other cities will take what we've done and just say, oh wait, this works for me, this maybe not so much, but a little bit, and take what we've done and reformat it to what they need. So rather than reinventing the wheel, they can hopefully at least pull some of our components, some of our code, some of our design, and make for an easier time, especially with a smaller .gov, where they just don't have the same resources. So that's why we try to keep everything open source. Yeah.
Kind of why I'm here.
Yeah. Do you have other questions, comments, concerns? Yes.
So you mentioned the mayor may have had a role in the initial push, or there's a political push.
Yeah.
But beyond that, who took the role in project managing, or what department kind of really took the lead in redeveloping Boston.gov?
Yeah, so Department of Innovation and Technology under Yasha Franklin Hodge. We ran the whole thing. So originally when I got there, there were 2 content managers at the city, and then I was the first hire under Lauren Lockwood. Lauren was the one who spearheaded the whole project. under the leadership and guidance of both the mayor and Yasha Franklin Hodge. And then she slowly built out the team to what it is almost today. Janeth took over not that long ago and has been building and continuing to spearhead the team. So it's all been housed within innovation technology, and we moved from being the web team to the digital team because our purview is much larger now than just the website. Yes?
So along those lines, going from web team to digital team, one content editor to 30 plus, that's a pretty big cultural shift.
Yes.
So the project needed to have a check from the top down, obviously, it sounds like you did. And talk a little bit about the cultural transformation, because as you said, the work starts when the site goes live to some extent for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a really interesting phenomenon working for the city. Everything is personal relationships. It's like this really old school Irish Catholic diehard kind of like, you know who went to school with so-and-so and you know their mom's ailments. And I hear those conversations all the time. And we recognize, I'm not from Boston, I'm from New York, but I recognize, and many of the other team members recognize that like, if we were ever gonna win people's trust and change the culture, that we'd have to meet people where they were at. And so we literally just started going door to door, talking to people, talking to administrative assistants, talking to anybody who would listen to us. Before any like big boom, like this is what's gonna happen, you know, like